everyone, Professor Davis here, and we are going to move on to our third chapter in medical terminology, where we're going to look at the organization of the body. And so in this particular chapter, we're going to review a lot of terms that are important in anatomy. So if you've taken anatomy already, a lot of this should be reviewed. So first thing we want to look at is we want to look at the cell structure really quick. So looking at the cell structure, remember that the cell does have a cell membrane. That's the outer part around the cell. It's what separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. We also see that inside of the cell there is a liquid that is called the cytoplasm. This liquidy kind of gel-like substance is going to be where your organelles are located and all of your structures that are found inside of the cell. We also then have the nucleus. The nucleus is really important here because it contains the genetic information. The genetic information in our DNA is going to be in the structure of what we call chromosomes. In humans, we see that we have a total of 46 chromosomes. This means you have 23 pairs. One pair comes from mom, one pair comes from dad, which gives us the total of 46, which makes up you. These 46 chromosomes are unique to you. Now this means that again, 23 came from mom in the form of the egg, and 23 were then delivered to the egg by the sperm. Okay, and so this 46 chromosomes is going to be what is really important because that's the number that we should have. Okay, now when we look at this too with these chromosomes, 22 pairs are called autosomes. They are the ones that everybody has in common. And then we have the single pair of sex chromosomes, which is the XX or XY. Now, when we look at cells like this that have the 46 chromosomes, those are known as somatic cells. They're your body cells. The egg and the sperm are known as your germ cells, or they would be the gametes. All right, so germ cells are going to have half the chromosomes. They are developed through meiosis, whereas your body cells are going to reproduce and we'll make more of them through mitosis. Now, one thing to note too is that our bodies are very organized. And so when we look at this organization, we need to go from the smallest up to the largest. Now, of course, the smallest thing that is going to be important to living things, of course, are going to be atoms. Atoms make molecules. But those two things are normally seen in chemistry. All right, when we talk about atoms and molecules, those are found in chemistry. We then find that there's these organelles. These are small structures that have specific jobs that are found inside of our cells. Our cells are the basic unit of life. Okay, so the basic unit of life starts with the cell. Now, when a group of cells works together, they're called tissues. When tissues work together, they form organs. Organs then are going to make organ systems, and then you have the organism as a whole. Now, of course, all these organ systems need to be working together in order for you as the organism to survive. Now, we just talked about the cell on the previous slide, so let's talk real quick about the 4 tissues that make up the human body. So there's only 4 tissues that make up the human body. The first one is the epithelial tissue. This tissue acts as an internal or external covering to our organs. And so our skin is going to be a type of epithelial tissue. The inside of your mouth, the inside of your ears, any natural opening has epithelial tissue. You'll also find it on things that cover the different organs inside of your body. We then have the connective tissue. Connective tissue has the property of an internal structural network. This network is known as the matrix. There's some cells in there, but the matrix is kind of the basis of the connective tissue. Connective tissue can have lots of different jobs. Your bone is connective tissue, so is your blood. You also have your fat tissue, that's connective tissue. So there's lots of different types when we're looking at connective tissue. Then you have muscular tissue. Muscular tissue has the unique ability to contract and relax, and this allows for movement. And so you have your skeletal muscle tissue, you have your cardiac muscle tissue, which is for your heart, and you also have your smooth muscle tissue, which forms your hollow organs like your stomach, your intestines, your bladder. Then we have the nervous tissue. Nervous tissue serves to provide for transmission of information, and it does it through electrical impulses. And so it's a very unique type of tissue that helps with coordination of the body. So when we look at these tissues, the outer layer of the skin or the lining of the digestive tract would be epithelial. Connective tissues like your bone, your blood, and your fat, which I said earlier. The muscular tissues, your heart, skeletal, and visceral are known as smooth muscle. And the nervous tissue includes your nerves, spinal cord, and your brain. Okay, so those are the tissues. Now let's talk real quick about the body systems, because there are 11 body systems that have to be working together for you to be successful. So this includes your cardiovascular system. Your cardiovascular system is going to be the system of your heart, blood vessels, and blood. This system is responsible for delivering things to your cells, the good things, and dropping them off and picking up the waste products and then getting them taken away from your cells. So this idea of delivering, they're going to deliver things like oxygen, glucose, food, pieces of things to build, like whether it's amino acids, that kind of stuff. And it's going to take away waste products, things like urea, carbon dioxide, that sort of stuff. We then have the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system works very closely with your cardiovascular system. The lymphatic system is going to help return fluid to your cardiovascular system to help you from swelling. Your lymphatic system also is going to help you with your immunity and capturing and taking care of foreign invaders. This includes your lymph vessels, your lymph nodes, lymph fluid, that kind of thing. We then have your respiratory system. Your respiratory system is going to consist of all the conducting things of air into your lungs and then back out. The point of this is to bring oxygen in and deliver carbon dioxide out of your body. This oxygen in your lungs then has to move into your bloodstream, so your respiratory and cardiovascular system work in very close contact. We then have your digestive system. Your digestive system is going to digest your food. So whatever food that you consume, it's going to break it down into smaller parts so that your body can then use it. Again, the blood is going to help deliver those components to the cells so that they can be used. The urinary system is going to get rid of your liquid waste. All right, so the urinary system, along with your kidneys, is going to filter out your blood and clean out all of those waste products and be able to remove them through your body where it's stored in your bladder before it leaves. The reproductive system is the one system that can be non-functional and you can still survive and not have any issues for the most part. But the reproductive system is for procreation in order to create new organisms. We do see that the reproductive system in males and females is different, whereas before all these other ones are very similar in males and females. The reproductive system is different in males and females. The muscular system is going to be all of your muscles through your body, and they are going to help you with movement when we talk about your skeletal muscles. The skeletal system are your bones. So your bones and your muscles work together in order to give you shape and, of course, the movement and protection for your internal organs. The nervous system is the system of your brain and your spinal cord, again, coordinating the activities of your body through electrical impulses. The integumentary system is your skin. So this is your skin, your glands, your hair. Again, it's mostly going to be for protection, but it also is going to help with regulation of like body temperature and water levels in your body. We also have the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is your hormones. These are going to work in tandem with your nervous system. They work together in order to regulate your body. So it's not just your nervous system, it's also your endocrine system with your hormones. Your hormones also play a big role in all the other body systems. So your nervous system and endocrine system are kind of the ones that are ultimately controlling the rest of the systems. So make sure that you review those 11 body systems. So let's talk a little bit about some of the prefixes that are going to be throughout this chapter. So a lot of these prefixes, guys, are going to kind of be in groups. These groups may include number or quantity when we're using these prefixes. Could be based on position and direction, which we'll see in a minute where we look at directional terms and planes. We also see negation in the sense of whether there's nothing there. And then there's some miscellaneous prefixes we want to see. So some of these that deal with number and quantity, this would be things like monochromatic, monologue, unicycle, unipolar. Mono and uni both mean one. We also have biceps, bicycle, dioxide. Bi and di stand for two, the number two. Triceps, triangle, tricycle, triathlon. Tri is going to be for three. And then you have quadriplegic. You also have quadruplets, tetrachloride. So when you look at quad and tetra, those are going to be your prefixes for the number 4. We also see that there could be some that like diplo is going to be for double. So when you have diplopia, where you have double vision. Hyperglycemia, hyper is an excessive amount, whereas hypo is beneath, like a lower amount. We also can have pan. When you add pandemic, pan means all. Okay, so when we say that all are affected, okay, again, deals with quantity. When we deal with like position and direction, this will be things like diameter, diarrhea, it means going through, enclose, endoatrial, endocardium, endoscopy, those all mean inside. So if you have en or endo or enda, Intermediate means between. So when we talk about like your heart is intermediate between your lungs. Intra is within. So when we say intracellular, it means within. Supraadrenal, that's going to be above a kidney. Superficial is above. So when we talk about superior, it means above. Infra means below, so inferior. So we're going to see that we have a lot of these terms. When we talk about negation, this is a lot of times when you add a in front of the word or a in, that means not or without. So when you say it's asymptomatic, it means that it doesn't have symptoms. It's without symptoms. Afebrile means without a fever. Okay, and so this is a big deal when we put things in front of it, like asexual means without sex. And so A is going to be like negating it, doing like the opposite. Okay. We also see another one that is inactivate, inadequate, induction, inhale. It means not or inside. And so again, if it's inactive, it's not working, it's not active. If it's inadequate, it's not good enough. Okay. Doesn't meet that standard. And so that's where some of these with negation comes in. When we talk about some miscellaneous, these are going to be things like the micro we talked about last chapter with being small, like with microbiology. We also have some like brady is for slow, so bradypnea or bradycardia. Bradypnea is slow breathing. Bradycardia is slow heart rate. Anytime you have that dys, that's going to be bad or difficult. So dysphagia, difficult to speak. Dysuria, difficult to urinate. We also then have tachy. Tachy is going to be fast, so tachycardia, fast heart rate. Tachypnea is high respirations or fast respirations. And so these are just some of the prefixes that you're going to really encounter a lot in this particular chapter. So let's talk a little bit about these directional terms, planes, regions, cavities, that sort of thing. And this is really a big review from Anatomy 1. So anatomical position is important. Anatomical position is when the person is standing erect, facing you with their palms facing out. The anatomic planes are imaginary surfaces or planes through the body where it cuts the body into certain ways to give us two different sides. It allows us to also be used to help identify some of the body positions. So we see that a frontal or coronal is going to separate our body into a front and a back, and that's normally cut through here. Okay, so this is going to be a frontal or coronal cut, and so technically it could be opened up like a book where you have a front side and a back side. So anterior and posterior regions. We also have a sagittal cut. A sagittal cut means that we're going up long ways like this, going across the body. This gives us a right side and a left side. Now, if it's right down the middle, we call that mid-sagittal. It's right down the middle. If it's off to the side a little bit, we call that parasagittal. Okay, because it's not right down the middle, but you still have a right and a left. We then have a transverse plane. A transverse plane is going to go horizontally across the individual. This is going to give you a superior and inferior side. All right, so it cuts a cross in that sense. So it gives you these sides. So we have anterior, which is front, towards the front, or the ventral side, the belly side. You have posterior, which is the back. So like posterior is the back side or dorsal. Superior is the uppermost part. Inferior is the lower part. Medial means towards the middle, whereas lateral means towards the sides. And this is what gives you all of those what we call directional terms on the body. All right, so anterior is front, posterior is back, lateral is to the side, medial is in the middle, superior is the top, inferior is towards the bottom. All right, and so this is a big part of these directional terms because it helps us sometimes know where to locate things. Or if it said it's just superior of their left eye. Well, so I'd go to the left eye and it's just superior. It could be in this particular region. And so this is where it can give us better indication of where things are located. Another thing we can talk about is supination and pronation. This deals a lot with the way things are moving. And supination is when the body is facing up. So supination, you can do that with your hand and it looks like soup. Right? It's where it's facing up. If a patient is laying supine, they're laying facing up. Whereas then you have pronation where it's coming down. Pronation is going to be where you were laying on your belly with your face down. All right, so these are just some things to kind of focus in on with, again, some of our terms. The next thing I want to talk about are these regions. When we look at these regions, we have two different ways that we can divide the body up for regions. You have the first one is where we have our quadrants. Now, quadrant means it's in four. So you can see there's four quadrants here. And these are the abbreviations. So when you see RUQ, this means right, upper, quadrant. That's all that means. LUQ means left upper quadrant. On the other hand, if you have RLQ, that's right lower quadrant. And when you have LLQ, that's left lower quadrant. So you have 4 quadrants. Now quadrants are used for really quick generalized type of locations of things in your abdomen. This would be like used in the ER a lot of times when the patient comes in with pain in their lower right quadrant. Okay, so their RLQ. That's going to be the area that then they would look at in a little closer detail. So the quadrants are used for very quick type of information, and you use them more like in an ER setting. The next one you'll notice has 9 divisions. These are your regions. And when we talk about these 9, it's really important because this is going to be more specific. We would use this more in like a surgical setting where we need to be more precise and more specific of the location of what we're looking at, where the pain is or the organ or things like that. And so when you look at these, region 1 on this is known as the epigastric. Epi means above and gastric means stomach, so it's above there, epigastric. Then to each side of the epigastric in regions 2 and 3, you have what we call the hypochondriac region. We have a right one and a left one. So it would be called the right hypochondriac region and the left hypochondriac region. We then see then 4 and 6 when we go down the level, 4 and 6, the 2 sides. That's your right and your left lumbar region. Whereas number 5 right there in the middle is the umbilical region. Okay, again, that's where your umbilical cord was attached, which is where your belly button is. Then when you look down at the last regions over here, you have 7 and 9. That is a right and left iliac. Okay, so you have a right and a left iliac region. And then you also have 8 there is the hypogastric, so below. So again, breaking those down and knowing where they are located. These 9 regions are used most of the time for identification where it's going to be more specific. Now, let's talk a little bit about the body cavities. When we look at the body cavities, this is going to be where we see certain organs that are located in those cavities. So when we talk about the abdominal cavity, that's in your abdomen. Your abdominal cavity is going to be divided into those regions and those quadrants that we just talked about. So your abdominal region is going to be divided into those. Just above your abdominal region, which is separated by your diaphragm, is your thoracic cavity. Your thoracic cavity is your chest. All right, so you have your thoracic cavity. Now, the lower part of your abdominal cavity is known as your pelvic cavity, but there's not actually a structure that separates these. That's why the picture here has a dotted line, because it's still technically part of your abdominal cavity, so sometimes they'll call it the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the cranial cavity is your head, okay? That's going to be the area that's going to have your brain. So the cephalic area is here. It's going to be with your head, cranial cavity. You also have what we call the dorsal cavity. That dorsal cavity running down your back is what contains your spinal cord. So a lot of times we might call it the vertebral cavity or the vertebral column as it comes down from your brain or your head. Those are those body cavities. All right, so let's talk about some terms here. When we're talking about terms, guys, in this particular case, you're going to see some of these prefixes that we talked about previously. So febrile is talking about a fever. So if it's afebrile, it's without. Antifebrile means it's against the fever. So antifebrile medication is to help fight or go against the fever. So pyrexia is also dealing with body temperature. So a hyperpyrexia is going to be a high body temperature. A pyrogen is something that actually produces a fever, whereas antipyretic is to also get rid of the fever. So these terms all kind of deal with a fever, but in a little bit different ways. We also have inflammation, which we've talked about a lot. Remember, that's where we can add itis to it, so inflammation. You have anti-infective, so again, against the infection. Antimicrobial or against microbes. This would be like bacteria, viruses, things like that. Antibiotic is against bacteria itself. So an antibiotic is a medication used against the bacteria. Anti-inflammatory is against inflammation. So again, giving you some of those prefix, suffixes, as well as some of those root words. Aplasia is going to be formation. So dysplasia is going to be where the formation is off. It's abnormal. So dysplasia. Aplasia means that it's without form. Anaplasia is going to be loss of cellular differentiation. So anaplasia is going to be where they don't differentiate anymore. They become more primitive. That's going to be what cancer cells end up doing. Hypoplasia is going to be a lack of development, whereas hyper is an abnormal increase in that development. These terms right here, when you see plasia, is going to a lot of times deal with types of cancer when we see that there's been a change, but they're not quite cancer cells yet. All right, and so it's when normal cells start to kind of go wrong. When you add trophy to it, it's nutrition. So hypertrophy is going to be an increase in the size of an organ caused by an increased size of the cells. And so hypertrophy is like what we see whenever you work out and your muscles get bigger. They're needing more nutrition to feed them in order for them to then grow. They get bigger. However, when you don't work out like that, your muscles start to deflate. They start to go down. That's called atrophy. All right, and so it's going to be bringing them down in their size, okay? Because remember, A is without or not, and so it's bringing them back to a smaller size. And so these are just some of the terms you're going to be seeing throughout, again, this chapter. All right, the next thing we want to look at are what we call our body fluids. Now, body fluids circulate in two distinct kind of systems. Now, they are related, and they do need to be able to communicate with each other, and some of them from the lymphatic system goes into the circulatory system when we're talking about the fluids. But we have our two groups. You have from the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. Now recall that the cardiovascular system pumps blood throughout our body. Cardio is going to mean heart. Vasculo means vessels. So it's blood flowing through our vessels being pumped by the heart. This blood circulating inside these vessels is also intravascular because it's inside the blood vessels. Another combining form of word that means vessels as well is angio. And so when you hear about an angiogram, we're taking a picture from inside the blood vessels. We're getting a record from inside the blood vessels. On the other hand, guys, the lymph is the clear fluid that is escaped the blood vessel. This happens when exchange of goods between our cells takes place from the blood to the cells. This fluid needs to be returned to the cardiovascular system, so the lymphatic system kind of absorbs it and helps collect it and return it back to the cardiovascular system. So when we see classification, we see plasma. Plasma is the liquid portion of your blood, the blood that's circulating through your body. We also have intracellular fluid. This is the fluid that's found inside of your cells. You have the extracellular fluid, which is the fluid found outside of your cells. Body fluids are comprised mostly, they make up half of your body weight, and it's mostly made out of water. Okay, so most of the fluid is going to be water with some things dissolved in it. Now, blood and lymph are the main two body fluids that we talk about. Blood is associated again with the cardiovascular system, and it's carried away from the heart by our arteries, and it's brought back to the heart through the veins. The lymph is associated with the lymphatic system. It's a thinner, more watery fluid than the plasma in the blood is. It's transported by the lymphatic vessels to the heart, and there are lymph nodes spread out across these vessels who are constantly filtering what is in the lymph in order to hopefully get any invaders or any debris out of there before it enters back into the bloodstream. Now, this brings us to a term that is really important when we talk about the human body, and this is known as homeostasis. This means same status. Homeo means same, stasis is status. And the point here is we need to keep an internal balance inside of our body. This is going to be maintained when we talk about body fluids by our intake of water and our output of water. So our intake is obviously what we consume, whether it's through our food or through our drink. And our output is what we lose through our urine or even sweat. We even lose a little bit of our water through speech in our respiratory system. So the intake again are through beverages, moist food, metabolism can help a little bit. Output is through your urine, feces, lungs, and skin. All right, and so this is the idea of fluid balance. It's really important. This is why when you're dehydrated, you start to get headaches. Your body's telling you to then consume more water, or your mouth will actually get really dry as well. So some word parts that come into play when we're talking about bodily fluids. We see angio and vasculo. Those are going to be for the vessels. Cellulo and cyte are for cells, as well as cyto. And then heme is going to be for blood, and hydro is what we use for water. Okay, so you have things like angiogram, vasculitis, cellulose, cytoskeleton, erythrocyte, hemoglobin, hydrophobic. These are all words that we would deal with a lot of times with those bodily fluids. We also see that you have heme, muco, pio, salio, and uro. Those are all going to be types of bodily fluids as well. The hemo are going to deal with there's blood present. Muco is with mucus. Pyro is with pus. Salio is like with saliva, and uro is going to be with more of like your urine. Another thing that's really important when we talk about bodily fluids are electrolytes. Electrolytes are molecules that conduct electrical charge, but electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and calcium are super important in the functioning of your muscles and your nervous system. And so making sure they're in the right quantities is important. We see certain diseases or medications that can lead to imbalances in these electrolytes. And if there is a deficiency in these, it can cause some major issues. So you have hypercalcemia, which is an excessive amount of calcium in the blood. Hypocalcemia is going to be a deficiency of calcium in the blood. Hypernatremia is a greater concentration than sodium. So naturo is going to be dealing with the sodium. We also could have hyponatremia, which is lower deficiency. And then we have hyperkalemia. This is when we see cal, K-A-L. That's talking about potassium. And you're like, wait, potassium starts with a P. Yes, but on the periodic table, it's represented with a K. And so that's where this comes from. And so you can have hyperkalemia, which is going to be your high levels of potassium, and you have hypo, which is your low levels. When we talk about blood, there's also some kind of root words and suffixes that come into play. Cytofibrin, so when you talk about fibrogen or fibrin itself, that's going to be part of the blood. Thrombo, okay, is another one. Necro. We also have poiesis, so if you talk about hematopoiesis, it's the formation of red blood cells. We also can have words like coagulation, which is going to be where there's a clotting of the blood. Fibrogen is where those fibers help with coagulation. And if we look at hematocrit, hematocrit is looking at the amount of red blood cells in the blood itself. And there's lots of different ways that you could end up putting these together. So let's do a quick review of the composition of blood. We talked about the plasma. The plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. However, the blood also has some formed elements in it. These formed elements include things like erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells, leukocytes, which are your white blood cells, and there are different types depending on what they do. You have neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And then we also have thrombocytes, which are your blood platelets, and they help with clotting. Now, with these formed elements, we can have lots of different types of blood disorders. When we look at blood disorders, you have things like thrombocytopenia. That's a big O word there. It means a decrease in the number of thrombocytes. So thrombocytopenia, thrombocyte is the platelets. Penia means a low number or decreased number that's present. If a piece of a thrombosis or a tumor or a air bubble or something travels through the blood vessel, we call that an embolus. An embolism is the presence of an embolus in a place. Hemolysis is the destruction of red blood cells. So hemo is the blood, lysis means to split or break. Toxemia is the presence of microbial toxins in the blood. So the toxin tells you that there's toxins, and emia means it's in the blood. Erythrocytosis is looking at the red blood cells, and this is an increased number in the red blood cells. We also see that they could be called polycythemia, where there's an increased number as well of the blood. Leukocytosis is increased white blood cells. This takes place a lot of times when you have an infection present, where you're fighting something. On the other hand, leukemia is a disease in which there's very large numbers of white blood cells, but these white blood cells tend to be a lot of times immature. They're not able to do the job that they're supposed to do. They're just taking up space. We also have erythrocytopenia. So penia, remember, means lower than level or decreased, and erythrocyto means red blood cells. This can also be termed a lot of times as anemia. So anemia is a condition where you have low levels of blood, specifically red blood cells. And anemia is a sign of lots of different types of diseases. There could be what we call aplastic anemia, sickle cell anemia. There's lots of different groups. The last little thing here with blood that we want to talk about with its composition is blood coagulation. So when we talk about blood coagulation, we have different structures that are going to help form blood clots. And they do this in like a series or sequence, and so they're really important through this process. Fibrino or fibrin means fibrin, and it's a substance formed that helps make the clot. Fibrogen is a protein that is important to change fibrin during coagulation. It keeps it from goes from being soluble, where it can travel in the liquid, to where it forms like a net-like structure in order to start forming the clot. Fibrinolysin is a substance that can dissolve fibrin, and so it breaks up the blood clot. 2 laboratory tests, especially important with people that have issues with coagulation, especially anticoagulants, is the prothrombin time, or PT time. This is going to be where they're going to see how long it takes for clotting to take place. We also see that they could do a partial thromboplastin time, or PTT. This is where factors are involved in different parts of the coagulation process, and it helps us report if there's an issue when you talk about like somebody who has hemophilia, where they do not clot properly. And so these are just some of the terms, again, that come along with coagulation. All right, so then we have transfusions, skin grafts, and transplants. You see that a transfusion is going to be where there's an introduction of whole blood or blood components into the bloodstream of a different person. This is really important that we do blood typing in order to make sure that we give the right blood to the person, because if we don't, let's just say that they're B blood and we give them A blood, this is going to cause a transfusion reaction to take place, which can ultimately affect the patient, make them worse off than they were before they got the blood in the first place. And this is why it's really important to do cross typing. We also see that when we're talking about transfusions or even skin grafts or transplants, we need to look at terms like autologous or homologous. So autologous means like auto means self. This would be like if I took a skin graft off of one area on my arm, or sorry, on my leg, and put it on my arm. That's going to be where it came from the same person, the self. Homologous means that it's similar, so it might not be exactly the same, but it's at least similar in that sense. Allograft and isograft. When we look at an allograft, it's the same as a homologous graft. The tissue is removed for transplant into a recipient of the same species. Iso also means the same when we look at iso. Allogenic. When we look at allogenic, this is like a bone marrow transplant. The donor with a close human leukocyte antigen type. So it's important, again, to make sure that they're a match. When we talk about a person being a match, this is what we're talking about here. Disease transmission can happen through transfusions. They can happen through transplants. One in particular is the hepatitis. Before we knew what hepatitis was, it can be transmitted through the blood. And a lot of people in the late 70s and early 80s were exposed to hepatitis without knowing, because we didn't know that it was in the blood. Cytomegalovirus is another one that's transmitted through the blood. It's also known as CMV. Cyto tells you cell, megalo means big, and it's a virus that gets in there, and it causes fatal infection sometimes in individuals, especially those who are immunocompromised, where their immune system's not doing what they're supposed to do. So in infants, elderly, or also people who have things like HIV or AIDS. We also see that syphilis is another reaction that can travel through the blood, and it's given off. And so this is just giving you, again, some ideas of how these disease transmissions can happen through bodily fluids, specifically through the blood. So when we look at immunity, the big thing with immunity is that our body is trying to protect us from something that invades. Immunity can also be described a lot of times as susceptibility. Some people's immune systems are not as good, and so they're more susceptible to diseases than others are. We see this in young people, again, elderly or immunocompromised. Your body's ability to resist the infection is going to be based on those cells. Now, when we talk about immunity, immunity is going to have what we call innate immunity, where everybody's born with it. This is like your skin. This is chemicals in your like saliva, your stomach acids, things like that. But we also all have specific immunity. Specific immunity is the immunity that we have based on what we've been exposed to. So my specific immunity may be different than yours based on what I've been exposed to as an individual. When we talk about specific immunity, these are going to be specific cells that are going to take place with cell-mediated type of immunity. These are your T lymphocytes, your T cells. They're going to fight specifically hand-to-hand combat against invaders. So they come into close contact. They're kind of like your foot soldiers of your immune system. On the other hand, there's another branch that's called your antibody mediated. This is going to be the ones who create antibodies, and these are your B cells. They are going to fight more from a distance. You can think of them as shooting off missiles or arrows. They fight from a distance, but they weaken the invader. Now, both of these need to be working in order for your immune system to be successful, and so they need to communicate with each other. What they're fighting is normally going to be identified by an antigen. An antigen is any substance capable of triggering an immune response. Now, normally, like I said, this is an invader. It's a cell that doesn't belong. It's a virus that doesn't belong, something that should not be there, and it's going to trigger your immune response. Now, this leads us to some different types of immunity that we see as well. So, active immunity means that your body is actually fighting it. You've produced the antibodies, you've produced the immune response. So you actively fought whatever it is. But if you look here, active can also be put with two different words. So if it's active natural immunity, this means you were just exposed to it. You were exposed, you fought it. On the other hand, if it's active artificial, this means you did fight it, but you artificially were exposed. This would be like a vaccine. On the other hand, there's passive immunity. Passive immunity means that you borrow. You don't actually make the immune response, you borrow it from somebody else. When this happens, you can have passive natural immunity. This is seen when some of the mom's immune system cells and the antibodies get passed on to the baby across the placenta or through like breast milk. That's going to be a passive natural immunity. On the other hand, passive artificial is, again, it's borrowed, but it was given to you like through a shot. This is seen a lot of times like with a RhoGAM shot, or if they provide you with an antitoxin. Like if you were bit by something and they do like an anti-poison, antitoxin type of shot. Now, when our immune system is working like it's supposed to, that's great, but sometimes it doesn't. In some cases, we see that there's an exaggerated response by your immune system. This happens with individuals who have allergies, asthma. If you go into like what we call anaphylactic shock, that means that your body is fighting something that really doesn't cause much issue or pain for you or issues for you, but it's fighting it and it's doing it hardcore, and that's causing your body to deplete its resources, and that creates a problem. And that's what we see a lot of times when we call them hypersensitivities, where your immune system overreacts. This is also seen in autoimmune disorders where your immune system attacks itself. So like when it attacks your joints, we see that you have something like rheumatoid arthritis. When it attacks your intestines, you have Crohn's disease. Okay, when it attacks lots of different organs, you have something called lupus. And so these are going to be where your immune system attacks you when it's not supposed to. Now, to kind of finish up this set of notes, pay attention in this particular chapter for opposites. Okay, so in last chapter, you needed to look at things that were real similar where it just changed it slightly. Now we have opposites. So ab means you're moving away from something. Ad is towards it. They're opposites. Afibrile versus fibrile. When we add a to the front of the word, it means without or not. Anti or pre is before. Post is after. End, and endo is inside, whereas ecto, exo, and extra is outside. Hypo versus hyper. Hypo is going to be where it's below or less than normal. Hyper is more than normal. Macro is large. Micro is small. Nulli is none. Pan is all. And then, of course, you have your super or supra, which is above, your hypo, infra, and sub, which is below. So pay close attention, because these are going to help change the word, whether we're looking at it being above or below, high or low. These terms can help us determine what's going on in the body. And so this is just a brief overview of the organization. It's kind of a little bit of a quick talk of the first two chapters in Anatomy 1. So like I said, if you've had Anatomy 1, this should be mostly review. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know.